Imagine you've been saving for 3 years, not to buy a house or for a wedding, but a car. And not just any car, the smallest, loudest, slowest car you can possibly afford. A car that, according to journalists of the time, barely deserved to be called an automobile. One that some people, without any affection whatsoever, nicknamed Povera Machina, the poor machine. And yet, the day you pick it up, you climb into that cabin barely a meter wide, you start that 2-cylinder engine that sounds more like a lawnmower than a car, and you probably cry. Because that ridiculous noise meant that, for the first time in your life, you were free. That's what the Fiat 500 was. Not just a car, it was the first car for millions of people who had never owned one before. And once you understand that, everything else about this story changes completely. To understand why this small, noisy car mattered so much, you have to understand the world it appeared in. Italy in the mid-1950s was not the Italy of luxury tourism we know today. It was a country still rebuilding what the war had taken apart. Cities were dense, streets were narrow, fuel was expensive. Getting around meant a Vespa if you were lucky, a bicycle if you weren't, or waiting for a bus with quiet resignation. A car was still a middle-class object, something you saw parked in front of other people's houses. Fiat had already tried to change that with the 600 in 1955. It had worked, but even the 600 was still out of reach for many. What was missing was something even more essential, a car that didn't try to be impressive, just possible. The average Fiat factory worker earned around 38,000 lira a month. The new 500 would cost 490,000 lira. 13 months' salary, more than a full year's wages, without spending a single cent on anything else. An enormous sacrifice for a car that, on paper, had nothing extraordinary about it. But there are sacrifices people make willingly, especially when what they're buying isn't a car, but something they've never had before. The man tasked with turning that idea into metal, rubber, and gasoline was named Dante Giacosa. If you don't know that name, you should. Giacosa had spent 2 decades solving Fiat's impossible problems. He was the father of the Topolino in 1936, the company's first serious attempt to put Italy behind the wheel. Then the 600. He was, in plain terms, the engineer you handed the problems nobody else knew how to solve. And the 500 was, in more ways than one, exactly that kind of problem. The brief was simple to say and brutal to execute. A car smaller than the 600, cheaper than the 600, that used less fuel than the 600, and somehow carried 4 people. Giacosa solved it with a philosophy that sounds almost obvious in hindsight. Don't build less of a car, build exactly the right car. Engine in the back to free up space up front. 2 cylinders instead of 4, not out of limitation but out of precision. No radiator because air cooling the engine eliminated a part that broke, cost money, and added weight. A self-supporting pressed steel body, light, affordable, and surprisingly rigid. The result was 2.97 meters long and weighed around 470 kilograms. For context, a modern compact car weighs nearly 3 times as much. Giacosa wasn't designing a sports car or a luxury vehicle. He was designing a tool for freedom, and at that, he was absolutely brilliant. Let's talk about the actual car, not the myth, not the icon, the concrete object someone drove Monday through Friday. The engine was an air-cooled 479cc 2-cylinder. It produced 13 horsepower. 13. The speedometer went up to 85 kilometers per hour, which was also roughly the actual top speed. It consumed around 4.5 liters per 100 kilometers, a figure that was genuinely extraordinary for its time. The gearbox had 4 speeds, no synchro mesh. Shifting gears required technique. If you got it wrong, the car let you know with a noise loud enough to turn heads down the entire street. The side windows didn't roll down all the way. The roof was canvas, which in summer might seem like a perk, and in winter was a constant reminder of your life choices. And the original version had 2 real seats and a rear bench that Fiat generously described as a seat, but was more honestly a statement of good intentions. And no, driving an original 500 was not a refined experience. At higher speeds, the little 2-cylinder vibrated with an intensity that seemed to travel through the entire body of the car. On the open road, the engine noise became a constant physical presence. In a crosswind, it could feel less like a drive and more like a negotiation, but maybe that's part of what shaped its personality. The 500 never tried to insulate you from the journey, it made you feel all of it. And yet, the car worked. More than that, it lasted. That was the real genius of the design. An engine so simple that a neighborhood mechanic could fix it with basic tools. No complex electronics, no cascading systems. If something broke, you could fix it. And if you couldn't, someone on your street probably could. It's the principle behind anything that lasts for decades. Fewer parts, good parts, parts anyone can understand. On July 4, 1957, Fiat presented the Nuova 500 to the world. The response was lukewarm, and that's being generous. The problem was twofold. First, the price. 490,000 lire was too close to what the Fiat 600 cost, a car that offered more space, more power, and more of practically everything. But the second problem was more interesting. The 500 was too honest for its moment. Italy in 1957 was beginning to prosper, and newly arrived prosperity has a very specific visual language: chrome. The more chrome your car wore, the better. The 500 had no chrome. It had exposed wheel bolts, frameless headlights, and a body with no decorative trim whatsoever. It was almost a manifesto of radical austerity at a moment when people wanted exactly the opposite. The press called it povera macchina. Potential buyers would look at it on the showroom floor and simply walk over to the 600. But the most interesting thing about the 500's early failure wasn't that people hated it. It was that many people understood perfectly well who it was made for. Nobody wanted to admit they were that person. The 600 could still feel aspirational. The 500 couldn't. The 500 was mechanical honesty stripped bare. No chrome to show off, no power to impress, no space to project a more comfortable life than you actually had. Fiat responded fast. Within 3 months, they launched updated versions with chrome window trim, aluminum hubcaps, and decorative headlight rings. Same mechanics, different clothes, and it worked. But what ultimately changed the 500's story wasn't the chrome, it was the country. Between 1958 and 1963, the Italian economy exploded. Wages rose. Factories ran around the clock. For the first time in generations, millions of Italian families had money left over after covering the basics, and they spent it, among other things, on mobility. And that's where the 500 truly found its place. Because once the initial fantasy of progress faded, many people began to value something simpler. A car they could afford, maintain, and use every day without fear of going broke in the process. The 500 stopped being the cheap car. It became the reliable one. The D version of 1960 bumped the engine to 499 cc and 17 horsepower. Not powerful, sufficient. And sufficient was exactly the promise. That same year brought the Giardinera, the family variant with a longer wheelbase and a horizontally mounted engine to free up a flat cargo floor. Craftsmen, salespeople, and entire families started depending on it to get through the working day. The 1965 F version cemented the model for good. Safer doors, cleaner lines, small refinements that didn't change the soul of the car, but made living with it a little easier. And then something happened that Fiat probably hadn't planned. People started to love it. Not because it was sophisticated, not because it was fast, not because it was comfortable, but because it was always there. This is where the numbers start to mean something beyond statistics. The 500 didn't have one kind of owner, it had every kind. For the factory worker in Milan, it was the first object in his life that put him on equal footing in terms of mobility with someone from the middle class. It didn't make him wealthy, but it made him free. For many Italian mothers, it was real independence. No longer completely tied to someone else's schedule, someone else's car, someone else's availability. For young people, it was adult autonomy. The first time they could go wherever they wanted without asking permission or waiting for a ride. And the economics weren't a small thing either. Filling the tank cost a fraction of what any larger car demanded. Parts were accessible. Keeping it running didn't require wealth. All of that created something Fiat had never quite planned: emotional identity. People didn't say my car, they said my 500. Just the number, as if they were talking about someone with a personality of their own. Loud, small, stubborn, dependable. And somewhere in that, the 500 stopped being a product entirely. It became part of daily Italian life. In theory, the Fiat 500 should have disappeared much earlier than 1975. Fiat already had something newer. The Fiat 126 was more rational, quieter, more refined, and objectively better in almost every measurable way. It was supposed to replace the 500. But there's an enormous difference between replacing a machine and replacing a symbol. People didn't want to let go of the 500, because by that point the car had stopped being purely about transportation. It was familiarity, it was memory, it was the sound that had filled Italian streets for nearly 2 decades. The new model had better numbers, but the 500 had history. And that emotional resistance explains why, even after Fiat launched the stripped-down R version in 1972, designed almost as a bridge toward the 126, enormous numbers of people kept buying the old 500 anyway. Not because it was better, because it already belonged to their lives. Of course, not everything about this story is practicality and domestic nostalgia. There were people who looked at the small 2-cylinder engine and thought, what if we push it all the way? Karl Abarth was exactly that kind of person. In 1958, he took the 500 and built his own version. It went on to set 6 international records at Monza. With the car, the market had received with skepticism. The 1963 595 raised the displacement to 593 cc and reached 27 horsepower. Then came the 595 SS, then the 695 SS, capable of 140 kilometers per hour on less than 700 cc. But the interesting part wasn't just the speed, it was what it proved. The 500 had been designed as a humble, economical tool, but it was so light and so mechanically simple that any improvement transformed how the car behaved, immediately and dramatically. The austere starting point turned out to be an unexpected advantage. The last original Fiat 500 left the factory in August 1975. 18 years of production, nearly 3.9 million units. But maybe the numbers were never the most important part of this story, because even today, on certain narrow streets in Italy, you can hear one before you see it. That small, uneven, almost ridiculous sound of an air-cooled 2-cylinder engine. And for a moment, something strange happens. Entire generations recognize immediately what they're hearing. Because so many Italians learned to drive in a 500. So many had their first kiss in one. So many brought their children home from the hospital in one. So many crossed the country for the very first time in a machine with barely 13 horsepower and just enough room for a small suitcase. That's what the Fiat 500 actually became. Not a great automobile, not a masterpiece of engineering, not even a status symbol, but a small machine that appeared at exactly the right moment when millions of people needed something, anything, to show them that their lives could finally start moving forward. And maybe that's why it's still so hard to let it go.